Okay, in this video I'm going to be talking about two things. The first thing is the band descriptor, and the second thing is the key or the error key that I'll be using in the feedback videos of people who are doing the speaking exam with me. So let's start with the band descriptors, which is what you can see here. And these are what the examiners use to determine what grade you would get in the IELTS exam. So they would usually start around 6 here, and they'd either move up if you're very good, or they'd move down. So this is the public version, which is a lot less detailed than the private version that each examiner is allowed to have with them in the exam room. They're not allowed to take them home, obviously. You'll never find the private version available because they're under lock and key. Now let's start here at, let's say, for example, let's start at a band 6 and have a look at what they're looking for. So first of all is something called fluency and coherence. And this is making sure that you speak relatively fluently, you don't have hesitation, you don't repeat yourself, and you use what's called discourse markers or signposters that help to navigate the listener to what you are trying to say. So you use words like however, and the listener will suddenly realize, okay, you're changing or you're contrasting what you've been saying before, and the listener needs to be ready to hear you say something on the opposite side of the argument, for example. So let's start with the 2 points in number 6, and then we'll look up at what number 7 is expecting. So at number 6 it says you can speak at length, so you don't find it difficult to speak for a long time on a particular topic. There are some times when it might be difficult to follow, lose coherence. It might be sometimes a bit difficult to follow exactly what you are saying. There is sometimes occasional repetition or self-correction, and sometimes some hesitation. Okay, so that gets you a 6 for this one. For number 2, there is a range of connectives. Like I said, the words like however, on the other hand, nevertheless, that said, all these things are called discourse markers or connectives. So there might be a range of them, but they're not used always correctly or appropriately. So you might overuse them, for example. You might underuse them. You might use them, but they're in the incorrect place. Okay. So let's look at number 7. What you can start to do to improve that is to speak at length, but without any noticeable effort. And there is no loss of coherence. So I can still follow what you're saying generally. There are some language-related language-related hesitation at times, but at times means not regularly, just every now and then, some hesitation. And there may be some repetition at times, and there may be some self-correction at times. So you're making a few mistakes, but you're self-correcting, and that shows that you are aware that you're making mistakes in the first place, and you're aware that they are important to correct, to make it clear for the listener. So that's giving you a 7. And then you use a range of connectives and these discourse markers with some flexibility. That means you're not just using always however, you're using however and nevertheless and on the other hand and that said, etc., etc. Okay, and so it goes all the way to the top. When you're at a 9, you can speak fluently with only a little bit of repetition and self-correction. Any hesitation is content related rather than grammar or word related. So you might have hesitation because you're talking about a very difficult topic, but it's not because you don't speak English well. It's because you can't think of what to say for that topic. So it's not language related. You speak coherently with fully appropriate cohesive devices. So the cohesive devices, what they're talking about is these discourse markers here, and they're perfectly accurate and not too many, not too few, right in the correct balance. And develops, now this is a key one, to get a high grade for this one, you need to develop the topic. So you're not just going to say, for example, using the word for example, and then give the example, and then that's the end. You might say, This is what I believe. For example, examples. And then in the third stage of that idea, these examples show that such and such. It's a bit similar to what you have done in the reading course with me. Those three stages of an idea, and you need to try and bring that into your speaking as well. A little bit more difficult, but we'll be doing some practice on that in this course. Okay, now let's move on to the lexical resource. Let's start with number 6, as is usual. So you have a wide enough variety to discuss topics at length. So you don't just say yes or no. You can speak relatively quite a lot about this particular topic because you've got enough vocabulary to do it. And you can make things clear even if you do make inappropriacies or make a few mistakes. It's still relatively clear for the listener to understand what you're saying. And you are able to paraphrase successfully. So you might hear the question. The question might be, do you believe that children should start reading from a very young age? And if I just say, yes, I believe that children should start learning from reading from a very young age, that's not paraphrasing. That's copying exactly what the examiner says, and that doesn't help to show off your level of English. So what you could say is, yes, for me, from my personal experience, learning to read from a young age was of great benefit to me because it allowed me to, etc., etc. So it's not exactly saying what the examiner said. Of course, I'm using the word read, and I might use the word believe, but everything else has been changed grammatically, lexically. So that is what they mean here by paraphrasing. Now, moving up to number 7, let's have a look. So uses vocabulary resources flexibly. So not using the same word like believe, 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 but think, my opinion is, etc. And you are able to discuss a variety of topics. So if the topic comes up like, I don't know, talk about a writer, an author that you like, you should have enough vocabulary to say, okay, well, this is a tricky question, but I can still talk about it because I can start talking about how I'm not an avid reader, but the magazines that I've read, there's a particular writer that I particularly like, and he writes an article every week for a magazine about cars, for example, and I like him. I can't remember his name exactly, but I know that whenever I get to his column, I'm always fascinated by what he has to say. So you don't have to know the topic, but you can certainly have the vocabulary to explain why you're not very good at that topic, but you can still talk for 2 minutes, especially in part 2 of the exam. Okay, it uses less common and idiomatic vocabulary. Okay, this is very important. To get from, you'll see that anything below a 6 does not expect you to use any idiomatic vocabulary, but thereafter, to get your 7 and 7.5 and 8, you need to start using idiomatic vocabulary. So instead of, for example, relax, you say put my feet up. Okay, instead of instead of do the same job as my father, you would say to walk in the footsteps of my father, or to take a leaf out of my father's book. Those are idiomatic phrases that are worth knowing to get anything above a 6. And appropriateness of style and collocation. So style is the tone that you use, the register that you use, so you're not being overly informal, you're not being extremely formal, you're not being archaic. Archaic means it sounds like you come from the 1920s. So the style of your language is modern and appropriate for spoken English and appropriate for a formal spoken interview like you're doing in a real IELTS exam. Collocations, words that typically come together, words that often come together like a swimming pool. Swimming and pool are often together, and think of them as single words. It's not just that. You could do prepositions like show interest in. To show interest in somebody, we don't say show interest on somebody. We don't say do interest. We say show interest. So those 3 words are technically collocations, and we're looking out for those in the vocabulary or the lexical resources section here. And there are occasionally some inappropriate choices, but you're at least trying to show off your higher level of English in your vocabulary and phrases resource section. So don't be afraid to try, even if you think you might make a mistake, just try and do it, because it's better than being stuck at a safe 6. Take a risk, understand you might make a few mistakes, but there's a better chance to get a 7 if you do take a few risks. And again, talking about this paraphrasing, so using the appropriate, not copying exactly the question and the words within the examiner's question, making up your own words from that. To get right to the top, to get to a 9 for the lexical resource, you're able to use full flexibility, so you have a wide range of vocabulary and it's absolutely accurate on any topic that comes up in the IELTS exam. And there again, there's that word idiomatic. If you want to get those really high bands in the lexical resource, you need to show off your idiomatic language. And you need to use it naturally, so it doesn't sound like you've tried to shoehorn it in. That's an idiom. Shoehorn is a thing that you put into the back of your shoe traditionally. Nowadays you don't see them, but traditionally you put this thing in the back of your shoe, and that allows you to get your foot into the back of your shoe. This is for men especially, but women as well, I think, had them in the 1930s and 1940s. So if I shoehorn something in, it feels like I'm pushing it in. It doesn't quite fit there. And I have noticed some of my students try to shoehorn in idioms, and it's good. It's going to get you a 7 or an 8, but it'll never get you a 9, because it's clear to the examiner that you're just trying to put some idioms in there because you know that you need to get those in for higher grades. So practice using them naturally and accurately, but don't just shoehorn them in all the time, because you're not going to get those high 8s and 9s if that's what you're really aiming for. Let's move on to grammatical accuracy and range. So looking at number 6 first. So it uses a mix of simple and complex structures, but with limited flexibility. Okay, so you're able to use simple grammar, of course, but also complex structures. And complex structures are embedded clauses within sentences, and we'll talk about that a lot more in the rest of this course here. So complex structure is very important, and you make frequent mistakes with complex structures, but at least you try. And even though they are mistakes, they seldom or rarely cause comprehension problems. So at least you're trying to show off your complex language, but yes, you do still make mistakes. That still gets you a 6, which is not bad. Now let's move up to the next level, number 7. So it uses a range of complex structures with some flexibility, so not just simple, but mostly complex, and frequently uses error-free sentences. Okay, so even if it's relatively complex, error-free, that gets you a 7. And there are, however, some grammatical mistakes, but it's not too bad. Okay, they're still there, but they're not too bad. Now, going all the way up to number 9, you have a full range of structures that are natural and they're used appropriately. And so it says a full range of structures. That means they might use simple for effect. You'll see some writers might make short, simple sentences for effect. And so a person who's getting band 9 for this is because they know that if you use simple sentences like, I was stunned, I was amazed, that's a perfectly correct sentence. It's very, very basic, but they're using it for effect, because when you have a short sentence, it's punchy, and the listener, or the examiner in this case, is, okay, tell me more. So it's not, you don't only have to use complex sentences. If you use more simple sentences for effect, that's great. Produces consistently accurate structures apart from slips, characteristic of native speaker speech. Slips are mistakes that native speakers make, that every native speaker makes just because it's so easy to do. I mean, I know that I used to incorrectly So did you used to go, right? I make this slip. Technically, because there's a D here, we don't, it's already negative, sorry, it's already in the past. Technically, we're not supposed to use the past D. So did you used to go? But I know even in my writing, I often make this mistake of putting the D in there anyway, because I'm just so used to seeing these two words together with a D at the end. Okay, so that's called a slip that native speakers make, and that's what they're talking about. So everything's accurate. Grammatical mistakes that are made are typical of native speakers anyway. Still, you get a 9. All right, let's look at pronunciation. This is something that's not often, well, this is a, let's say, a category that's not spoken about in any of the other listening, speaking, writing, listening, reading, and writing skills. But it's very important to get right in this one because, as you can see, that's worth a quarter of your total grade. So pronunciation is important. Okay, now let's look at number 6. So it uses a range of pronunciation features with mixed control. Okay, so when it talks about pronunciation features, it's not just talking about getting the correct sounds of English, but it's also connected speech. It's also weak forms, things that we're going to be talking about in this course. And mixed control is sometimes you get it right, sometimes you don't get it right. But on average, it's understandable. Shows some effective use of features, but this is not sustained. Okay, so again, talking about the style, you might use, focus your attention on a particular word, emphasize it. I absolutely believe that children should be able to read from the age of 4. And if I use the word absolutely, that's showing one of the features of emphasis. But I might not get it right every time. It's not sustained. So you're trying, but it's not correct. It's not absolutely correct. No, the intonation is not always perfect. So it gets you a 6. Can generally be understood throughout, though mispronunciation of individual words or sounds reduces clarity at times. Okay, so there can be mispronunciation, but it's of individual words and sounds. If it's entire sentences or 3 or 4 words, I'm afraid 6 is too difficult. 6 is too hard for you, and we're looking at a 5 or a 4 or something down here. So you need to have individual words or sounds that might be problematic, that might cause mispronunciation, but that's all. Okay, let's go up to number 7. Actually, it says 8 because it says positive features of 6 and positive features of 8. So let's have a look at 8. So it uses a wide range of pronunciation features, which is very similar to this. Sustains flexible use of features with only occasional lapses. So still using, knowing how to use connected speech, knowing how to use weak forms, getting the right intonation, getting the emphasis in the right place, but occasionally there's a few mistakes. And it's easy to understand throughout. The accent of the speaker, the L1 speaker, has minimal effect on intelligibility. Now, this is an interesting thing. Often a question that is asked by students is it worth me doing the IELTS exam in London or in an English-speaking country, or should I do the IELTS exam in my own country? And the answer, strangely enough, is often to do with this. If you are from a place like France, for example, where the examiner has heard the French accent outside of his exam building, where they're doing the exam, hears it on the street, hears it in the cafe, hears it every day at work, for example, then they are going to be more used to that accent, and so likely your pronunciation grade is going to be better if you are French and you do it in France with an examiner who's not necessarily French, probably going to be British or American or something like that, but they are used to that accent. And so in that case, yes, I would agree. However, if you're in the UK, for example, that examiner might not get used to your accent. So, for example, Thai students or students from Vietnam who do have trouble in pronunciation when it comes to English, I would recommend that perhaps if you have a chance to do the IELTS exam, do it rather in Vietnam or Thailand, where the examiner is more receptive to your style of pronunciation compared to London or New York. Okay, let's look at this last one. Number 9 uses a full range of pronunciation features with precision and subtlety. Subtlety means it doesn't sound or doesn't look like you are trying to use this feature. You just use it without thinking about it, and a person who's listening doesn't notice that you're doing it. So that's subtle, and it's correct precision. Uses flexible language throughout, so a use of features throughout. So again, all those things that I was speaking about, the connected speech and weak forms, it's used throughout the exam. And effortless to understand. At no stage do I have to think, okay, what was he saying there? I need to think in an Indian accent, or I need to think in a Russian accent. What are they actually saying? It's never a situation for me there. Okay, so that's the band descriptors. And now what I will be doing is talking to you about the key, or the error key, that I will be using for the speaking feedback videos. So you'll see that if it's green on the screen, that means it's good. And D refers to discourse markers. So they're using discourse markers very effectively. However, that said, on the other hand, on top of that, in addition to this, there's lots and lots of discourse markers, and also called connectives. And you'll find that these connectives in one of the lectures in the speaking course. So we'll talk about that, but look out for discourse markers especially. If it needs work, it'll be orange with a little question mark. And often, if it needs work, often I'll give a alternative or a better discourse marker instead of what the student used, or there may be cases where the student didn't use them at all and it's necessary to use them. Then we're looking at lexis. That's I put the V for vocabulary because most people think of V as vocabulary, and this is talking about vocabulary and phrases. Those two things together is called lexis. So what we'll be looking for is, a student might say big houses, which is fine, grammatically correct, but you're trying to show off your higher level of English. You want to get a 7, 7.5, 8. Then you would say, for example, lavish mansions. A mansion is a type of house that is very grand, a lot of space. So you may want to say big houses, but if it is literally a huge mansion, like some very large houses of wealthy people in Saudi Arabia, then lavish, lots of luxury and ostentatious, then by all means, please use the more accurate vocabulary to describe what you're talking about. A student might say new types of clothing, but you would like to, improve your grade, so you would say something like the latest trends in fashion. The latest popular things that are related to the fashion industry, as opposed to just new types of clothing. Okay, so new meaning the latest, trends, types of, in fashion, of clothing. Okay, that looks better than this. Sorry, the other way around. This looks better than this because it shows off your higher level. Now we're talking about this idioms and idiomatic language. So I mentioned these before. So put your feet up instead of relax. Relax is a very common word, very popular word, and there's no problem to use it. But if you want to show off, you would say, that's one thing I love to do is put my feet up after a long day's work and read my book. Now, you may well literally put your feet up, but if you mean, just to relax, then that's the idiom you want. Take a leaf out of my father's book. I spoke about this one as well. Take a leaf out of my father's book, or walk in my father's footsteps, or you might even see walk in my father's shoes. Some people say that means do the same job or follow a similar career to my father or to my mother or to my brother or whoever it is. Okay. Then talking about pronunciation and intonation, a few of the things we spoke about already. So individual words incorrectly pronounced. So the word honestly is without an H sound, but you might put the H in there, which is not a major problem, but it's going to bring down your grade just slightly if you do this regularly. Look at this. A lot of students, if you're, for example, speaking Spanish or Italian, most languages, in fact, it would be I get up at 8 in the morning. Okay, but we want to use connected speech, and a Germanic language like English or Danish or Norwegian, we do this. I get up at 8 in the morning. I get up at 8 in the morning. I get up. Even this becomes a D sound, especially in American English. I get up at 8 in the morning. I get up at 8 in the morning. Okay, and that's called connected speech. So that happens. Oh, sorry, I'm mixing this up. What I'm showing you here is what happens in French and Spanish, etc. But yeah, connected speech happens in most languages. Sorry, let's mix it up. So this is what I'm talking about. If you're from Spain, especially European Spanish, it's in the river at the bottom of the valley. This is equal weighting for each syllable in your language. But in English, it becomes like this: in the river at the bottom of the valley. In the river at the bottom of the valley. And you can clap along. In the river at the bottom of the valley. The river, or the strong syllable in the word river, re, is the same length as in. In the river, at the bottom of the valley. Okay, but we'll talk about that as well. This is called weak forms. We'll be talking about those in this course as well. And then finally, grammar, focusing especially on complex structures, unless you're using simple structures for effect. So, so you could say something like, you could say people don't know that. Many people don't know that Bangladesh is famous for whatever. But you could make this a lot more complex by using a relative clause, using that and with the word what. So what people often don't realize about Bangladesh is that it is, very successful at whatever. Okay, so we're trying to avoid more basic English and using more complex structures. Look at this one here. This is a this is a conditional. So using if with a comma. So if given the choice, if people are given the choice, and because it's a complex structure, I can take away because we've got people here already. So if given the choice, most people in my country would. Okay, and I'm using a conditional here, so it shows off my complex high-level English. All right, so that's what we're looking for, and so just look out for these little symbols here, and they'll help you to be better prepared to understand what's going on in those feedback videos for each student. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.